I can only be lonely as an individual. We can only be lonely as an individual if we think about ourselves being separate from others. As soon as that thought has gone, as soon as that idea has gone, then loneliness can't even exist. Hi, my name's Andy, and welcome to Headspace. No, not really. Actually, if you use the app, you're probably not used to seeing me because they keep me locked in a very dark studio. After 7 years, they let me out. And the more I thought about how I wanted to spend my time, the more I thought about how nice it would be to maybe go on a bit of a journey together. The techniques of meditation are just one small part of how to live a healthier and happier life. I feel I can share it in a very different way out here than I can when I'm sitting in the studio. And that's it really. So, shall we go? So we're here on beautiful Lake Powell, and one of the most amazing things about being here is a sense of quiet. It's a sense of being away from everything and everyone. I want to be away from everyone, but I think there's something in all of us at times that actually we kind of long for that, to be out in the middle of nowhere. It's an interesting thing, right? That sense of aloneness. And maybe even whether we crave it, like it, enjoy it, embrace it. It's very different from feeling lonely, you know. I think aloneness is a good thing, being at ease with ourselves, with boats beeping and flashing, making lots of funny noises. I think that's okay, you know. I think it's really healthy if we can get to a point where we're okay on our own. Loneliness, that's a different thing. I think can often feel kind of very challenging. It can feel quite destructive. I think it can feel very isolating. And it's often tempting to look outside of ourselves and to look at our situation in life, and maybe even to blame kind of that situation on how we feel, that feeling of loneliness. We might blame people in our lives, or we might just blame the situation that we find ourselves in. But in trying to get away from that feeling of loneliness, I think we miss the opportunity to understand what it is. We miss the opportunity to get comfortable with it. And so in some ways, I think we don't really address the problem. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that we wouldn't want to kind of share our lives with those around us, to find perhaps a partner in life, whatever it might be. At the same time, that in itself isn't the answer to peace of mind. You know, peace of mind is being okay with the mind as it is, and sometimes the mind's lonely, and also embracing just different phases of life. You know, we go through life and there are times when we're on our own through choice, and other times when we're kind of with others, and the other way around is equally true. And not trying to force that in any way, kind of allowing that to unfold, I think is part of that journey of loneliness. I think the more we can get kind of comfortable with that, the more powerful it is. You know, if we're always chasing a distraction, then, as I say, we don't really have any opportunity to really understand it. And as we look at what it means to be lonely, I don't know if you ever thought, but what does it mean? We might say kind of, I feel lonely, but is loneliness, is it an emotion? Is it a thought? Is it an idea? Is it the idea of loneliness, maybe, that we feel? If we look underneath that idea, maybe we find some emotions. Perhaps we find a desire, a longing for company, or we might discover a fear of what it means to be on our own. We might feel a sense of sadness or anxiety. But I think if we look more closely underneath the idea of loneliness, actually we start to see that more often than not, there's an emotion or a combination of emotions at play. And alongside that, there's a storyline, there's a conversation, perhaps trying to explain those emotions to ourselves, trying to make sense of it in some way. I think that can be really powerful to look into that and to start to understand what is it that underpins that feeling of loneliness in our lives. It's funny, sometimes people will say, I never really notice it until I stop and I sit and I practice. I do my meditation. And it's almost as though meditation sort of makes me lonely. Or I feel lonely when I meditate. It's a really interesting idea. I mean, clearly meditation doesn't make us feel lonely. We become more aware of our feelings. But also I feel when we sit to meditate, if we truly sit down with the intention to benefit those around us, in sitting down, actually that's the one moment in the day when arguably there is the most potential for, although we are alone, so there's aloneness, there's the most potential for not necessarily feeling lonely. We're plugging in, we're connecting to the world around us. We're stepping out of our own individual thoughts, our own worries, concerns, our own intellect, and instead, just resting in the moment, we're actually connected with everyone and everything around us. So in some ways, you could say the antidote to loneliness is to be more present, not caught up in the story of loneliness, but rather resting in the present moment, whether it's with our breath in meditation, or whether it's with our other activities throughout the day. Whether we are on our own or with others is neither here nor there. And in fact, I've met so many people who say they are surrounded by people in their life. They are constantly engaged in conversation, dialogue, through social media, through email, on their phone, and yet they still feel lonely. So it's not enough to kind of look outside of ourselves and think that that is the answer to get away from loneliness. Instead, it's letting go of the story that we have in our mind, not in a negative way. It's natural to experience that profound sense of loneliness if we've lost someone in our life. Perhaps if we've gone through a difficult breakup. It's natural to experience that feeling of loneliness, but we need to get underneath that. We need to understand what's the emotion, what's the story behind it. Not analyze it, but just understand it, to see it clearly, and in seeing it clearly, we're able to let go of it. And then we can be present, then we can be free, and then we can be at ease, being alone or being with others. It's interesting when I think about that idea of aloneness and loneliness, and I think about different phases in my life, and if I think back to training as a monk, training in meditation and staying in some of those places, often those places nobody spoke any English, and I did experience kind of some feelings of loneliness. And I think when I looked at what sort of underpinned that, I think part of it was not wanting to be with my own mind, my own feelings at that time. I think part of it was a sense of, it was almost driven by a sense of nostalgia, a life that I had known in the past. And perhaps sometimes an idea of what life could look like again in the future. But when I let go of that thinking, then there was no loneliness. There was still the feelings, there was still emotions present. And part of that journey was embracing that, being okay, like allowing that feeling of sadness, of fear, of desire, whatever it might be, to simply be present and to be present with that. And meditation is not trying to escape those things. It asks us to be present with those things. And in some ways, I could even say in the journey of practice, meditation, there is a continual stripping away of our sense of identity, a sense of self. I think in quite a healthy way, you know. It's almost like peeling the layers of an onion. And we discover actually our sense of vulnerability. And when we do that, I think inevitably we come across loneliness. And that could, I guess, if we got very involved in it, if we really kind of put a lot of energy into that thinking, that could have been really quite destructive, I think. But this path of practice is that we bring everything kind of into it, even those difficult times, challenging emotions, feelings of loneliness. And I feel like almost as though that feeling of loneliness provided very specific conditions where there was nowhere to go with it. Couldn't create a world around us where loneliness would disappear other than leaving the monastery. So it was a very vulnerable sort of feeling to sit with loneliness. Not comfortable. But there is a journey, I think, that we can go on, we can choose to go on, where it becomes more comfortable over time and where we find a greater sense of courage actually sitting with loneliness, with whatever the feeling is at the time. So I feel like it's almost part of letting go of a sense of self. I can only be lonely as an individual. We can only be lonely as an individual if we think about ourselves being separate from others, separate from the world around us. As soon as that thought has gone, as soon as that idea has gone, then loneliness can't even exist as a concept. So then all of a sudden that idea of stepping out of the mind, stepping out of thinking, dropping that storyline, that becomes really powerful. Because then there is only now. There's just this moment. And it sounds so easy. I know how difficult it can be, especially in those moments in life where we wish so desperately that things felt differently. But I think to know that that condition of loneliness is part of being human, and to know that it's something that we all experience. To know that we don't set the timeline. We can't make it. We can't use meditation to try and make it go away. We can only use meditation as part of an approach to getting more comfortable with loneliness, to getting more clarity around it, to seeing what emotions and thoughts underpin it, and ultimately to then let go of that thinking so that we can sit with the mind exactly as it is. Loneliness can only happen when we are thinking about the emotion. So maybe I feel a sense of sadness. Maybe I've been through a breakup. And part of Part of me is longing for perhaps it's to be back with that person, or it's to be with somebody else, or it's simply not wanting to be on my own. Could be driven by fear, could be driven by sadness. But the emotion itself, that's not loneliness. Sadness is not loneliness. Fear is not loneliness. The thought that identifies the emotion, I feel sad. Why do I feel sad? I feel sad because of this. I feel sad because I've gone through a breakup and I really miss being with another person. Okay, all of this is conversation. It's what we all go through. It's completely normal, but that is the creation, if you like, of loneliness. At that stage, at the stage of emotion, of feeling fear, of feeling anxious, of feeling scared, that's not loneliness. Loneliness at that moment hasn't even been created. There is simply the emotion. And it might be an incredibly, I cannot even imagine if we've gone through our entire life with another person. To lose that person, I think, indescribable kind of sadness. And that's okay. It's okay to feel that indescribable sadness. That's not something wrong. That's not that life has somehow gone wrong. And that is our life in that moment. And it's whether we can be okay with that. We can get lost in it. We can get overwhelmed by it. And we will do sometimes. Or we can be open to that and allow that into our life. And if we do, then we start to uncover and discover things about ourselves that might surprise us, that we never even kind of knew that were there. And it can open, I think, it can actually be a gateway to not just greater understanding of ourselves and our own lives, but also to the lives of others and the connection, the place that we have in this world. There have been times, I think, there have definitely been times that I felt lonely and in my life. I think like all kids kind of growing up, there were times when I had lots of friends, good family around me, but I still felt lonely sometimes. I think especially kind of towards the time when I started thinking about going away and becoming a monk and going down that path. I think the disconnection between myself and people kind of around me, that was a cause or a condition for loneliness, Maybe not feeling completely understood, and in that sense, a little bit on my own, perhaps. Not in a sense of aloneness, being physically on my own, because I was still around lots of people, but just not really feeling kind of connected. I think when we don't feel understood, we feel isolated. And when we feel isolated, we often feel kind of lonely. So funnily enough, in going away and being with less people in a quieter place, I felt less lonely. I felt more understood. I felt accepted. I felt in a really, good spot. And then over time, of course, we sit with the mind, and, it's not always easy to sit with the mind. And I think eventually, there came a point where I definitely had to get to know loneliness in a different way. And then I think there's also kind of the flip side, you know. There have been times in my life when I've been really busy and quite overwhelmed by the amount of things. And almost as though not having enough time on my own has created a feeling of loneliness. I miss, you know, I don't mean right now, but sometimes I have missed that feeling of being on my own. Kind of this, you know, being out here is an incredible experience. It reminds me of how important it is. If we can, even if there's small moments, even if it is just a few minutes a day, you don't have to come out into the middle of a lake, in the middle of nature, but taking time away from our busy lives can actually create that feeling of being less lonely. It's kind of paradoxical, but sometimes it feels like that. If you're feeling lonely kind of right now, if that's the overwhelming experience, then the first kind of step is to, and I know this is a big ask, but rather than looking outside of yourself for the answer, if you like, to loneliness, if that's an idea even, to accept that maybe, just as a starting point, that maybe there is a different way of approaching the idea of loneliness. There's a different way to sort of getting to a point of peace of mind. And I would say that to begin with, it asks us to sit down and to give up any resistance to the idea of loneliness. So maybe it's just we start with just a couple of minutes where we sit down, even if we feel immediately overwhelmed by a sense of loneliness, allowing, might be a sense of sadness, allowing tears to come, it might be a sense of fear, but just for a few minutes, not resisting that, just allowing it. It can't hurt us. If we're sitting, if we're watching, if we're observing from a place of awareness. And once we do that, then all of a sudden, we've really taken away the main, you know, the primary thing that actually keeps that whole conversation happening in our minds. So if we can begin by simply doing that, being okay with feeling how we feel, not trying to change it, not trying to get away from it, and getting a bit more comfortable, a bit more familiar, building up a confidence in doing that, that in itself is incredibly powerful. And then as we get more confident in that, then we can start to maybe just get a better sense. Okay, so forget the feelings for a minute, just allow the thoughts to kind of come and go. All right, so what's the emotion? What's the overriding sense of emotion? And to begin with, even that can be really difficult, actually. That's not obvious. Some people are kind of, I don't really know, I feel a bit sad, but also I'm a bit scared, and that's okay. We don't need to kind of pin it down to one emotion, but just having a general sense. Perhaps leaving aside the idea of loneliness and just being a little more clear about what the emotion is. As we do that and we start to settle with that, then we can start to be a bit more confident in, we can use lots of different techniques, but for me the most obvious is noting, where we start to identify, oh yeah, thinking. And we start to see these stories, these patterns of, oh, I feel so lonely because, oh, okay, that's thinking. Now we might think that that's a justifiable thought, and of course it is, all thoughts, you know, are. But we might feel like that's a place that we should go. Maybe we might even feel guilty if we don't go to that place, if we've lost someone. But it's in seeing that thought and in letting it go that we reconnect. Even if we don't physically reconnect, even if we can't physically reconnect with that other person, it's in dropping the storyline and being more present that in some way we reconnect with everything and everyone around us. So to begin with, to accept that there is a different way to approach loneliness. To move towards a place of acceptance and embracing it, knowing that we will never understand it unless we take the time to be present with it. To look at what emotions really kind of underpin that idea of loneliness, and then to get comfortable in simply letting go of that story, letting go of that inner dialogue, and coming back to feeling more present in our life.